an 11 Warriors live emergency episode as I'm joined by Dan Hope and Andy Anders. I'm your host, Chase Brown, and we are here to talk about quite possibly the most surprising news that we've had in a long time, and that is that Michigan has fired head coach Sherrone Moore after 2 seasons with the Wolverines. Michigan fired Moore on Wednesday for cause after a university investigation found that Moore had engaged in an inappropriate relationship with a staff member. This was first reported by very verifiable, very reputable sources, and then very quickly was confirmed in a statement from Michigan Athletic Director Warde Manuel, who said that after an investigation, they had credible evidence that Coach Moore had engaged in an inappropriate relationship with a staff member and that there was zero tolerance for such behavior. I know that all three of us were caught off guard by this news. I was even just talking to Dan before this episode went live that we were both just kind of moseying around our house, getting ready for some dinner, maybe going for a walk. And then all of a sudden, this news comes in. So, Dan, I'll ask you first. Initial reaction. You see this notification pop across your phone. What's going through your mind?
Yeah, I was like about to walk out the door as like 4:35. It gets dark here around 5 now, so I'm like, I try to get outside, get a little walk in before it gets dark, and then check my phone. It was like, well, time to run back to the computer because yeah, this completely caught me off guard. I mean, we're sitting here now, less than an hour ago. I had no idea that this was coming tonight, so definitely a shocker. I know there had been some rumblings out there the last couple of weeks about something along these lines about Sherrone Moore, having an inappropriate relationship with a staff member, but, there had been nothing had been reported by, a major source or anything like that until this just dropped out of nowhere today. So yeah, a stunner. And I mean, you just think about it. I mean, less than 2 weeks ago, we were up in Ann Arbor watching Sherrone Moore coach against Ohio State. And now Sherrone Moore's tenure at Michigan is over. And so certainly a shocker and tough timing for Michigan because we've already had this absurd coaching carousel this year. We've seen all these big jobs get filled. We've seen a lot of other coaches use those big jobs to get big contract extensions with their current schools. So now it's like, where does Michigan go from here? Because signing day was last week. Most of the big jobs have now been filled, and now you're the one big job left that you've now got to fill.
Yeah, and it all is coming at a time, as you're mentioning, Dan, where it just is going to create a ripple effect. I don't quite know if we've seen one like it. There's obviously like Nick Saban retiring from Alabama created quite the ripple effect in college football. But Michigan is a blue blood program. I know that that might not hit the ears of Ohio State fans in the right way, but it's a program that it has the most wins in college football. This is one that is going to be a job that coaches are going to want, but the timing of it makes it so interesting. There already are coaches who have anteed up with their current schools and have been able to leverage openings to get themselves better contracts. But it'll be very interesting to see how this kind of carousel from here continues to go. Andy, I do want to get your thoughts. What were you doing maybe an hour ago at this point when this news comes across? I was caught off guard. Dan was caught off guard. I'm assuming you were in the same spot.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had recently posted that Jim Knowles was going to be the defensive coordinator at Tennessee. I was taking a break, feeding my lovely bearded dragon Biggie, and then I just saw it pop across on news desk or work group chat where Dan sent it, and it was just immediately like what like yo what kind of a thing. And then as it came out, I mean, I think my next reaction, more details came out, my next reaction was kind of laughter. It's like this the last 2 weeks has been the delayed righteous vengeance and justice served from the Connor Stallion scandal. That's what it feels like to me. Of like the people involved with it. Sherrone Moore didn't get caught, didn't get fired. Or I should say he got caught, but he didn't get fired for cheating on the field, but he did get fired for cheating off the field. So this was like, if you're an Ohio State fan out there, after a disheartening loss to Indiana in the Big Ten championship game last week, I mean, my dad called me. He was a massive Ohio State fan, fellow alum, and he was just laughing about it. Like it was kind of the news that I think a lot of Ohio State fans were happy to hear, even if it wasn't expected. But I think that made it even better for a lot of people. It's kind of just dropped out of nowhere on a Wednesday evening, and I think brightened a lot of Ohio State fans' days. So that was my initial reaction to it. Diving into more of what Dan said, as far as the timing of this, it's not just the coaching cycle, right? You got to think of this from a recruiting perspective. Michigan's recruits who just signed in this recruiting class now are going to have a window where they can transfer to other schools immediately, and the players on the team too, because of this head coaching change.
Granted,
happening
every school is going to have that in
and
January, so I don't know how much of that really affects things.
Yeah.
And, you know, but it's going to open for everybody in January. I think it's just more likely that guys are going to transfer now because you have a coaching change.
Yeah.
Right, that's what I mean more. Is like these people that just signed with Michigan, these stars that Michigan has, some of the stars Michigan has gathered in recent years, now they're all going to be reevaluating their decisions, and the vultures are going to circle, right? Everyone out there, there is talent to pick from Michigan's recruiting class, from Michigan's roster. And after this hard of a fallout for Sherrone Moore, you wonder exactly how much that's going to look like, exactly how many pieces get picked off for the future of Michigan. And that might ultimately also impact their ability to hire a really good next head coach. We'll see how it all plays out. But overall, I think this is just a nice piece of news to drop on a Wednesday evening for a lot of Ohio State fans.
Well, and you think about it too. You just mentioned that, in terms of hiring a new head coach. Now, obviously, firing for cause is significant here on Michigan's end. Now we'll see a lot of times when somebody's fired for cause, there are countersuits. So we'll see, what does Sherrone Moore and his camp, his lawyers, how do they respond to this action? But, theoretically right now, Michigan looking to get out of that contract without paying Sherrone Moore another dollar. But, oh yeah, you've got that huge fine you've got to pay from the sanctions that you got earlier this year. So, we talked about at the time, like, these sanctions felt like, a slap on the wrist. And I think compared to what they probably should have been, they were. But at the same time, well, that postseason ban would have costed them going to the Cheez-It Citrus Bowl. And now they've got to pay this big fine. Well, they've also got to go out and hire a new coach now. So these are all things that Michigan has to deal with now in terms of, moving forward. And it's going to be really fascinating to see now, who do they end up with as their next head coach. For me, I got to say the name that jumps to mind for me is Brian Kelly. Like, Brian Kelly's a guy who he gets fired at LSU, kind of a messy breakup there. Name, unlike a James Franklin, his name really didn't resurface at all in terms of the other jobs being filled. You think about his background, a lot of his earlier coaching jobs were up there in Michigan. So he has experience up there at Grand Valley State, at Central Michigan. He also has a close relationship with Bryce Underwood because LSU was the other school that made a big run at Bryce Underwood before he ultimately signed with Michigan. So that's the name that jumps to mind for me. Chase, how about you? Are there any names that jump to mind for you as guys who could be the next coach at Michigan?
I mean, you brought up James Franklin, and I'm just thinking about how that would be in some ways a win for Michigan fans and for Ohio State fans, because James Franklin turned around that program after, obviously all the sanctions that were levied against them. He then comes in, follows after Bill O'Brien, and is able to build that program into a perennial contender. And obviously, as you mentioned, I pulled up some of the numbers for what Michigan was handed in terms of sanctions over this past summer. And it was a fine that could range in somewhere around $30 million, that they were going to lose 10% of the budget, 10% of football scholarships, additional recruiting sanctions as well. And I'm just thinking about how Franklin would be so good in that spot, considering how well he did at Penn State. And then for Ohio State fans, it would be hilarious too, because I don't think that James Franklin threatens them in the slightest because of his record in big games. But
of course, I'm getting the job at Virginia Tech, so I think that's probably pretty unlikely.
Well, yeah, I was getting there. What I was getting to the point of saying that it's ironic in the timing that he had just been hired by Virginia Tech as of a couple of weeks ago. So if he doesn't end up taking that Virginia Tech job, he would have been the man in waiting for Michigan to get that to get him in the building. He would have been someone that has proven he can build a program from the ground up, from a program that's been levied sanctions against them. And so that's what also wrapped up into this timing is interesting as well. It's just because it puts them in a spot. You're talking about Brian Kelly would be someone, but other than that, do you go toward, you almost have to go toward schools or I guess coaches who are currently employed. And I think there's a long list of names that you could go to. The ones that I'm seeing across hot boards right now, I know you don't like that term, Dan, but the hot boards that are on social media, almost all of them have Lincoln Riley pictured in the front of it. Could he be somebody that they would target? There's plenty of other names, talking about, Will Muschamp is a name that could be out there. Kenny Dillingham. There's guys who are available or guys that maybe would pick up the phone if Michigan called. But yeah, I think that it's probably going to be if Brian Kelly gets that first phone call to see if you can bring him into an established power like Michigan. But yeah, that could just be messy considering the way that it all ended for him at LSU.
You mentioned James Franklin too. Matt Campbell's another guy that I think if he hadn't just gotten hired at Penn State, he would be very high on that list, maybe a top candidate. So that makes it tough timing for him. Obviously, I think another name that's still kind of floating out there on the surface is Kalen DeBoer. The idea that maybe if Alabama loses in the first round of the CFP, could maybe he be looking for an exit there and, a return to the North where he's had more success? Would that make sense for him? I don't totally rule out that possibility, but that's also would mean you got to wait at least a couple weeks before making a move. We'll see if Michigan can succeed in making its new hire sooner than Penn State was able to with its 50-day coaching search. Andy, how about you? Is anyone jumping out to you as a candidate?
Yeah, DeBoer was the next guy I was going to mention. I think it does depend a lot on that first round playoff game for them. Alabama fans, I don't think have been the most approving of DeBoer since like the standard that Nick Saban said it's pretty much impossible to live up to. They missed the playoffs last year, lose to Michigan in the bowl game, ironically. And then this year barely squeak into the playoffs and kind of a controversial decision by the committee in some places. And then Alabama isn't the power that it was under Saban. And I think there's a lot of angst about that, even though it's only been 2 years there for DeBoer. So I wouldn't be surprised if he does look for that exit plan after the playoff game, if they lose their first round playoff game. However, like you said, Michigan's going to want to move quick on this. Really, I think there's a few other long shots I kind of think of, maybe like a Lincoln Riley at USC, but he's landed a really good recruiting class and they're trying to build stuff there. And I don't necessarily think Lincoln would like coaching that far north. There's kind of also the sense of Matt Campbell emerged late in the process for Penn State, right? And wasn't kind of one of the initial candidates floated out there. So I think it could also just be a guy we really aren't thinking of yet that maybe Michigan looks into and tries to make that move. But like we discussed before, this is really bad timing because so many of the guys that were top candidates have already found new jobs or received raises and extensions from their current schools. So that's kind of where I sit with it. There's a good chance it's someone we haven't even talked about yet. But I think DeBoer and Brian Kelly would be two places to start, perhaps.
Dan just sent a tweet to our staff that Michigan Athletic Director Warde Manuel had indicated to team staffers that at least part of Sherrone Moore part of the investigation, which had become far more from a secret internally, had been going on since mid-November. So this has been something that's been in the works for at least a few weeks at Michigan before that decision was finally made. And again, that's another wrinkle of this whole thing that has kind of just been, I don't know, it seemingly is catching everybody off guard. And that is evidenced by, I think, in some respects, how much our readership and some of our loyal readers have responded to this news on our website as well. Just refreshed, as of 5:41, this article was posted an hour ago by Dan, that it has 334 comments on the article. I'm trying to think, Dan, of the top commented articles in 11 Warriors history. There's a few that stick out. There's the Quinn Ewers transferring from Ohio State to Texas. That was pretty big. Kyle McCord entering the transfer portal. That was another big one.
I know Chase Young's suspension was up there, as well as
Yep.
JT Barrett's DUI.
Those two as well. I'm sure that some of those early Connor Stallions news reports that we probably had got up there. But 334 comments in an hour. This might be the
How
number
many
one
Roman
story.
numerals will the Sherrone Moore firing Michigan coaching search threads get up to?
I mean, we have the article.
To you, 11W readers.
That's right. We have the article up on the website that has the 334 comments. There's also a few forum posts that are already up. One of them got to 54 before our moderators closed that post and directed people to the main article. So it's certainly something that it's going to develop. As I mentioned, Dan just sent that tweet, something that we're going to continue finding out more information about what exactly went down and what the conversations look like between Michigan and Sherrone Moore. Something else I had considered too, there's a number of Michigan assistants that have gone on to other places, some of them to the NFL, but a lot of those assistants have show cause penalties because of the Connor Stallions case and some recruiting violations. You go back to Burgergate and all that different stuff of what was happening at Michigan for the past few years. So it's not like they can call up some of their alumni as well. Like this is probably a spot where you are considering the only option is going outside of Michigan to find your next.
Maybe Kerry Combs can just be the head coach after his 4-day stint as special teams coordinator.
Yeah, and they do have Biff Poggi, I believe that's how you say his last name, Poggi, who is an incredible person to follow.
I should have worn the sleeveless shirt.
Yes, the sleeveless shirt.
New head coach.
He won a game earlier this season, and he had a great quote about going back and eating a pint of Haagen-Dazs on the couch and probably falling asleep after smoking a cigar. But I think that we're probably all in agreement that he's just going to be kind of the interim guy before they hire in somebody else for the program. His tenure at Michigan involved him being an assistant head coach to Jim Harbaugh and then leaving for a couple of years to go to Charlotte, I believe, and then coming back to Michigan. And his tenure at Charlotte did not go over very well. So I'm not sure that he's going to be someone in the running for a program as premier as Michigan. But I think that I guess, guys, if we transition here as Ohio State fans, should you view these developments? I think obviously Ohio State came out on top over Michigan on a couple of weeks ago in the most recent edition of the rivalry, but Sherrone Moore did beat Ryan Day last year in 2024, and he was the interim head coach during the 2023 game. So, he's 2-1, I guess, technically against Ryan Day and the Buckeyes, but it seemed like the rivalry has now kind of trended back in Ohio State's direction. Is it a good thing that Sherrone Moore is no longer Michigan's coach, or is it kind of something that we should view as negative if you're an Ohio State fan?
Yeah, I mean, kind of a mixed bag. I mean, it's like, I think if you're an Ohio State fan, you're probably going to have that schadenfreude today. Hopefully not, I don't think anyone should ever be rooting for, affairs that break up families or anything like that. So hopefully, people aren't taking joy so much in that part of it as just the fact that bad things are happening to Ohio State's rival. And like Andy said before, I think particularly with what happened with the Connor Stallions scandal, the fact that Sherrone Moore deleted text from Connor Stallions, clearly had knowledge of what was going on and only got the slap on the wrist of a 2-game suspension that he served this year and a 1-game suspension that he had yet to actually serve. I think that certainly to see him get comeuppance is not something that Ohio State fans are going to feel particularly bad about. But yeah, in terms of a long-term outlook of a program, I mean, so much of that really does depend on who does Michigan hire next. Do they find the right coach next? Because you look at Sherrone Moore's record, I believe it was 16-8 over 2 years. He was not killing it. So I think that Ohio State fans probably felt pretty good about Sherrone Moore's the coach there. But that's probably bodes well for us, at least in terms of Michigan not being a national championship threat again. So I think in that regard, like it's like, maybe you wanted Sherrone Moore. I mean, I think there's you probably go to the other side too. There's probably Michigan fans that are like, well, this got him out of here without us having to pay him. Like I think there were certainly plenty of Michigan fans, particularly after the game a couple of weeks ago, who were ready to move on from the Sherrone Moore experience. And, I think a lot of it too, like, if we just kind of zoom out for a minute and kind of just look at the whole, like, you promote an interim coach to head coach. Sometimes it works out really well. Sometimes it doesn't. Ohio State has been very lucky with Ryan Day that it has worked out very well, promoting him under not the same circumstances by any means, but some similarities in the sense that, like Sherrone Moore, Ryan Day coached for a few games the year before when Urban Meyer was suspended. Then he becomes the full-time head coach for next year. Very similar situation with Sherrone Moore in that regard at Michigan. And, you just don't, when you do that, when you take a chance on someone who is a first-time head coach, promoting him internally, you have that familiarity factor. And I don't think anybody would blame Michigan for what they did there, because you would just won a national championship. This guy had played a major role, including being the acting head coach of a win over Ohio State in that role. So I think it was the obvious move to promote him, but you just never know when you hire an interim coach and promote him if it's going to work. And I think now we can unequivocally say it did not work for Michigan. Yes, they got the one win over Ohio State last year, but this year, to miss the playoff, to lose to Ohio State, lose really their three biggest games, and now have him get fired. It certainly did not work out for Michigan. And now you find yourself, in an interesting spot. Like, do they try to keep some of the pieces that they have in place under a new head coach, or do they use this now as a time to fully move on from the Harbaugh era and start from square one?
Yeah, and I'm also considering too.
And I think that's something that should be.
Go ahead, Andy.
Oh, Andy. Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's also something that should be noted in this, is that Sherrone's last game at Michigan will forever be losing to Ohio State in dominant fashion on his home field in Ann Arbor. I think that's another thing that's probably sweet for Ohio State fans about this, is that's the final game for his legacy as a coach at Michigan, is Ohio State possibly turning the tables of the rivalry, winning by 3 scores in a way where they out-physicaled his program that had been prided on winning that game with physicality, and that was their whole message of toughness and whatever else. You showed him up in that fashion in the big house, and that's the end of his Michigan career soon after that.
I'm on the college football thread on Reddit. Some of the names that are popping up here are making me laugh. The top comment, 217 upvotes, is, has Dusty May ever coached football? Then we got a couple of people talking John Harbaugh might be wearing out his welcome in Baltimore. Maybe you bring in John Harbaugh, brother of Jim. We got Connor Stallions. Jesse Minter was one of those assistants that I mentioned, has a show cause for being unable to coach in the NCAA if he were to be hired. They also have a couple of names. Urban Meyer. That would be interesting. Yeah, not going to happen.
No.
Nick Saban, Jonathan Smith. The list is going on of people just tossing out these names. Some of them obviously more jokes than serious, but yeah, it is just a situation that Michigan finds themselves in that I will be curious. And I'm also going to say this, something I was just considering too while reading the names. One of them was Lane Kiffin. How quickly do you think he's been on the phone with Bryce Underwood to get Bryce Underwood to transfer to LSU? That was initially where Underwood was committed. I don't know what Underwood's ties look like to the Michigan football program, what kind of contract he signed with any of their collectives or any of their scholarship agreements, what that looks like. But that could be an opportunity for Lane Kiffin to slide in and take away Michigan's quarterback. And then if Michigan doesn't have Underwood, what do they have coming back? They have players that are like the coaches left over from the Harbaugh era, but there are few of them. And then there are going to be players who, as Andy and Dan have mentioned, are going to be maybe seeking the portal to transfer to new opportunities. So what kind of roster you would have when you arrive as the next head coach is also up for debate. and under question. So that makes this whole thing kind of an interesting development as well. I guess, what would you guys make of that scenario of schools coming after Bryce Underwood? And if they don't have him, what kind of roster do they have?
Yeah, I mean, obviously he's not in the portal yet, so legally, at least, schools cannot contact Bryce Underwood. He is from Michigan, so he has ties to Michigan that are more than just Sherrone Moore, even more than just money, like you said. I mean, the contracts that were out there, I'm sure there's some stipulations in that contract. And, you know, someone like him, like, he had a good but not great freshman year. Would he go get more money if he was to transfer someone else when he was supposedly given, 12 million or whatever it was to go there? So there's a lot of factors for him to consider. And that's going to be true for, a lot of players on the roster, whether it's a Jordan Marshall, Andrew Marsh, Jimmy Rolder. Those are just some of the names that come to mind of, great players on their roster. A lot to consider there. And some of that, because some of that probably won't bear out until a new coach is hired. Because, I mean, the one good news for Michigan is the portal does not open until January 2nd. And so they do have a few weeks here to get a new coach in place and try to keep their roster together. But inevitably, I mean, there's going to be turnover no matter what in college football these days. When you have a coaching change, there's going to be turnover. So certainly the new coach, whoever that may be, come in, is going to have a lot of work to do to keep the roster together, to bring in new talent, and again, doing all of that while still dealing with those sanctions in terms of, finances from last year.
And so would you explain, Dan, because this is something that I've questioned, I think our audience probably would have questions as well. With Sherrone Moore's firing becoming official, does Michigan have a transfer portal window that has opened for them immediately, in addition to the portal that would then open at the start of January?
So they changed the rule for this year so that the new portal window does not open until the new coach is hired, rather than when your coach is fired. And so I'm not entirely certain how that works, if it's before the January 2 portal window, if like the portal opens earlier, if it's open longer for them, or if it's just the same window. Again, I think because the portal is going to open for everybody in that January timeframe, I think the rule change was kind of made to make it more moot unless you have a coaching change after that first January transfer portal window. So I don't know that I don't think in that specific regard, it's likely to have a big impact on Michigan. It's more just the fact that they're going to have a lot more players thinking about the portal because their coach is gone.
Yeah. And as you had mentioned too, legally speaking, there are coaches and there are staff members that shouldn't be reaching out to these players. But Ohio State fans will know well that Carnell Tate hadn't entered the portal last year. Jeremiah Smith hadn't entered the portal last year. And we're getting these numbers reported that they're getting offers in the $5, $6, $7 million range to come transfer to different schools. Those schools are unnamed. Who knows if those offers were ever actually real? But there seems to be still, even though there are more regulations around NIL at this point in the transfer portal, as you mentioned, there are still some bad actors at work that are going to maneuver those rules and look for loopholes to get in contact with these players so that they can build their roster. So that will be a development to watch as well. And even if the portal hasn't officially opened, that won't stop a Michigan player from indicating that they will enter the transfer portal in January. There are plenty of things, if you're following on social media with Hayes Fawcett's tweeting out graphics seemingly every hour, that there are players who are going to put their name in the portal in January and going to look for a next destination. As far as the next topic, guys, I think I've spoken my piece about Sherrone Moore, this situation. Andy, we haven't gone to you in a little bit. If you've been thinking or stirring on anything, I'd love to get your input. But yeah, I guess anything that you have left on the floor.
Yeah, and I don't know if anyone's asked anything in any of our live stream chats, but not really. Other than, again, I think for Ohio State fans, I'd say it's okay to enjoy the Schadenfreude for an evening. You look to the future and see where Michigan's program is going to go after this, because you always have an eye on the rival, right? But I think that, again, this just feels like justice for what happened with the Connor Stallions stuff, for Sherrone Moore's role in it. And I think for the university that always prided itself on being leaders and best, on holding some, it felt like moral high ground over a lot of other places. You had the terrible computer crime stuff that happened. You've had Burgergate. You've had this Connor Stallion stuff, and now you have this. Like, whatever golden reputation and self-image that Michigan has propped up of itself over the years, it's been shattered, at least by the public, outside of Michigan. So, yeah, I think this is just a moment for Ohio State fans to laugh and smile after what happened at the Big Ten championship game this weekend.
And one more point to make too of everything you just mentioned, like at what point is Warde Manuel's job on the line? Like you mentioned it, like he's had 4 major scandals happen in what, 3 or 4 years? Like at some point you got to think that his job could be on the line too. I mean, certainly maybe helps how well the Dusty May and the men's basketball team are doing, but on the football side of things, and like you said, I mean, that's a lot of scandals to happen in a very short amount of time. And so, I think certainly if you're Michigan, it's one more reason to look internally about like, why do these things keep happening within our athletic department? Why have we had one scandal pop up after another? And certainly that's one of those things. If you're Michigan, you've got to factor that in to the hiring process. I mean, I mentioned a guy like Brian Kelly sincerely, but at the same time, you just look at the messy breakup that he had at LSU. Like, I think if you're Michigan, you got to be thinking about, okay, like, do we need to be really careful about making sure we don't hire anyone with any baggage right now? Because you've had so much happen here in the last few years that it's got to make you think twice about who you hire, and not wanting this pattern of scandals to continue, though, as Andy said, Ohio State fans would probably be just fine with it if it does continue.
And there was the development too, maybe a year ago at this point, with Santa Ono trying to go to Florida, and Florida denying his bid to become the next president there. Then he becomes a man without a home. They currently have an interim president at Michigan. I don't know what their latest developments are to hire a new full-time president, but whoever does come in is going to have no allegiance to Warde Manuel as their athletic director. So that could be something that happens quickly if it doesn't happen in the short immediate time, with the board of trustees over at Michigan deciding to move on from him quickly. So that is also a development to watch, as much as the coaching hire as well. A couple of more comments I'll address from Reddit, and then also got a few from our chat of people who are saying who Michigan should hire. One of them is Dave Portnoy. How about Dave Portnoy being the next Michigan head coach? Rich Rod is another one that was mentioned. Brady Hoke is available. There's certainly some names that will create plenty of laughter. I'm sure our comment section is full of them as well. But yes, as Dan and Andy and I have mentioned, enjoy this as you have it. Saturday was obviously an experience that no Ohio State fan had fun with, but now here we are about a half of a week later, 3 or 4 days later, and Michigan has fired its head coach, which is going to create plenty of storylines throughout the month of December, or until they hire their next one. But as far as that goes, let's go call it there. How's that sound? It's been a great episode, great conversation, talking with you, Dan and Andy. We will have plenty of coverage available on 11warriors.com. I'm sure George, our guy that runs the Dubcast, is going to be queuing up some conversation about this for tomorrow's episode of the Dubcast. So yes, there'll be plenty of conversation about it. As always, I'm joined by Andy Anders and Dan Hope. I have been Chase Brown. Make sure that you keep up with all of our coverage over 11.